People of Reddit. What's a nsfw piece of history everyone has forgotten about? Raphael, the Renaissance painter the Ninja Turtle is named after, died after having sex with his mistress for an entire day without stopping. When then President of Indonesia Sukarno visited the Soviet Union, the KGB thought that it would be a good idea to send a honey trap. They hired two escorts to entertain him and recorded the acts using a spy camera. When blackmailed, President Sukarno laughed at the agents and asked them to send him the tapes so that he can watch it back home. King Ferdinand I, or Ferrante, of Naples kept a so-called Black Museum of the mummified remains of his personal and political enemies. He had them dressed and arranged in various scenes and would often show off the museum to potential rivals, enemies he hadn't yet killed off. So yeah, pretty messed up. The inventor of the autopilot crashed his plane while attempting to join the Mile High Club. Interns several years ago stole a huge number of moon rocks brought back during the Apollo missions, spread them out on a motel bed and had sex on them, just so they could say they'd had sex on the moon. We would have more mummies nowadays if the Victorians didn't eat them all. James Joyce had quite the fart fetish and immortalized it in some very dirty letters to his wife Nora. I don't remember much at all of Ulysses from school, but God do I remember the letters. Andrew Jackson beat the brains out of multiple men while in office. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, apparently lost her virginity on her mother's grave. Victor Hugo was so popular with Parisian prostitutes that most brothels in Paris closed down for a day of mourning and many SWS stood outside to pay tribute. The Newport Sex Navy heard that there was a common spot where enlisted and civilian men who have sex with men would go for hookups or relationships. To investigate, they sent enlisted personnel to gather intelligence, which resulted in them soliciting sex and participating in the same immoral acts that they were trying to criminalize. To embarrassment for the Navy, local clergy, many of whom had been discovered engaging in homosexual behavior during the investigation, and political fallout for those in charge of the investigation. Hey, we need to figure out if enlisted men are trying to have sex with each other at the Army and Navy YMCA. Got it. Well, let's send some enlisted men to the Army and Navy YMCA to try to have sex with other men, and we'll keep track of who goes for it. The Radium Girls from the United States. Just read a book on them, and it was horrific. The radium poisoning made their jawbones fall out with their teeth. Not to mention all the sarcomas and the one girl who hemorrhaged and bled out because the poison ate through her jugular. They were told the radium was safe despite there being known health risks as early as 1901. There were still radium factories being operated as of 1978. Baby farmers. Why one assumes unmarried mothers were of course looked down upon, and if you were in service and knocked up by the son of the owner you were a bit fucked, as no one else would give a single mother a job. The solution, baby farmers. Baby farmers were basically an industry to adopt for a fee, of course, these babies. Of course, some of these farmers realized that it was somewhat noisy and expensive looking after a whole bunch of babies, and so they used a tonic called Godfrey's cordial. Said tonic contained opium, which knocked out the babies, and they were fed it by a few unscrupulous baby farmers until they starved to death. They then disposed of baby, advertised again, and the cycle begins. A particularly notorious example, look up Amelia Dyer or John and Sarah Mackin. The KKK lost its power in the 1920s because the Grand Dragon bit a girl to death. See Stevenson. 796 babies' bodies found in a septic tank in Galway, Ireland. 796 babies. The reason informed consent is legally required in study participation. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, a group of 600 impoverished black men were part of an experiment to observe untreated syphilis. 399 of these men had syphilis while the rest were used as a control group, all participating with the promise of free medical care. The men who had syphilis were never told they had it. Instead, they were gaslit and offered placebos to treat bad blood, while the researchers told local black doctors to deny them was supposed to last 6 months. It lasted 40 years, and even though penicillin was used as an effective treatment 15 years after the start of the study, it was never offered to them. During World War II, 256 infected men were drafted and diagnosed by the military unfit to serve without treatment. The researchers got them excluded from the draft to continue the experiment unbothered. It only stopped after news of the study was leaked to the press in 1972. 128 of the men had died directly or indirectly from a completely treatable disease they were never told they had, and 59 relatives of the men contracted or were born with syphilis as a result. The Romans fucked a natural birth control into extinction. I forget the details, but essentially there was an herb on semi-Greek island that acted as a natural birth control. The Romans proceeded to fuck so often that said plant no longer exists. They didn't start using anesthesia on babies until the late 1980s. It wasn't until 1987 that the American Academy of Pediatrics declared it unethical to operate on infants without the use of anesthesia. Mothers were doing everything to convince doctors that their babies could feel pain. But since the doctors said they would have no long-term memory at that point, then it wasn't as important. That's not very long ago. RomWiki, in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century, citation needed, doctors were taught that babies did not experience pain and were treating their young patients accordingly. From needle sticks to tonsillectomies to heart operations were done with no anesthesia or analgesia, other than muscle relaxation for the surgery. Citation needed the belief was that in babies the expression of pain was reflexive and, owing to the immaturity of the infant brain, the pain could not really matter. Shel Silverstein's writing that wasn't aimed at children was very vulgar. In 1944, 9 American airmen were shot down over the Japanese island Chichijima in the Bonin Islands. 8 were captured by Japanese troops and were then beaten, tortured, and executed by beheading. Their remains were cannibalized by Japanese officers. The ritual cannibalism included eating the livers of freshly killed prisoners and eating living prisoners over several days, amputating limbs to keep the meat fresh. This case was investigated in 1947 in a war crimes trial, and of the 30 Japanese soldiers prosecuted, 4 officers were found guilty and hanged. All enlisted men were released within 8 years. Vice Admiral Mori Kinaizo, commander of the Shishijima Air Base, believed that consumption of human liver had medical benefits. He was initially sentenced to life imprisonment for his involvement in the incident, but was sentenced to death and hanged after a separate trial for other war crimes. The 9th airman who successfully evaded capture was eventually rescued. 45 years later, he was elected President of the United States. The Battle of Blair Mountain. Coal miners wanted to unionize and mine owners wanted more money. 1 million rounds of ammunition were fired and the National Guard had to intervene. That's a shamefully short summary of it, but it was literally a war for labor. Quote Robert Evans on Behind the Bastards Part 1 on YouTube here. We never talk about the time they got bombed and gassed and shot at by machine guns. We just leave that out of history books. The 8-hour workday was entirely gained by polite people with signs protesting. That's how we have a weekend, not the men who charged machine gun nests and sniped at corporate guards. Used a part of life like the fact that you're supposed to get a weekend. All of these things were bought in blood by men who are willing to kill for these rights, who are willing to die for these things. And we don't talk about that even though it's cool and interesting because it might give people ideas. Benjamin Franklin loved banging whores. Philip Barton Key, son of Francis Scott Key, was murdered in broad daylight by Congressman Dan Sickles. Sickles had learned that Key was having an affair with his wife. The ensuing trial was a sensation, and Sickles became the first person in the U.S. acquitted based on a temporary insanity defense. Nintendo had sex hotels at one point. Nipple ring fad in Victorian England. In ancient Pompeii, the way they would direct you towards the nearest brothel was with a dick engraved into the pavement and walls pointing the way towards it. The engraving survived a volcanic eruption, so if you go to Pompeii today, you will find the paths literally paved with dicks. The Dutch ate their prime minister. Unit 731. These dudes made the Nazis squirm. Thanks for watching.